I'm convinced that no one actually likes GCSE English Language Paper 2. It's just not a fun paper, but that doesn't matter because you're still going to do amazingly, because in this video I'm going to be taking you through last minute tips for how you're going to be structuring your answers, your responses in the exam tomorrow to make sure that you are able to be hitting top band marks, consistently getting 8s and 9s in every single one of those questions. No fluff, let's just get started. You should be familiar with the structure by now. It's pretty much the same structure as for English Language Paper 1. Except instead of looking at some piece of fiction, some piece of narrative, you're going to be looking at a non-fictional text. Question 1 is purely comprehension. It's the same kind of comprehension that you have been doing since year 1. You're going to be told to pick out 4 features from the text from a certain number of lines. Make sure it's from those lines. If you're the kind of person who is just naturally going to go beyond and look for other things, quite literally get out a ruler, draw a line underneath where you should be looking, and only look at the very specific section from which you need to be picking things out, because that is the most common reason that people people lose marks on this question, simply because they're not looking in the right place. Make sure you're only lifting your answers directly from the text. You're not inferring anything. You're not thinking, oh, well, because it says something similar to this, then I can sort of leap it. No, you cannot. If it doesn't explicitly say, for example, that, I don't know, the leaves are green, if it says that it was summertime and the leaves were on the trees and you write the leaves were green, well, no, you're not going to get the mark because you're making an inference. Do you see what I mean? So only write down what is directly on there, and don't spend any more than 5 minutes on this question, because ultimately it is 4 marks. If you've spent 5 minutes on it, you've only got 3 things down, that's so fine, move on, it's 1 mark. Also on that, make sure you are looking at the correct source, because then in the next question you're going to be asked to compare the 2 sources. Now pay close attention as to whether you're going to be asked about looking at differences or looking at similarities between the 2 sources, because it'll explicitly say in the question, underline it just to keep you focused, and you're basically going to be comparing them both. And that can be quite difficult. You might think, okay, how do I actually structure something like that? Because one of the most common things that examiners will pick up on is that students will describe the first text, describe the second text, and then not actually talk about differences or similarities. They sort of just list things about one and then separately list things about the other. And that is not what the question is asking you to do. If you do that, you are not going to get top marks at all. You're hardly going to be able to get out of the first 2 bands simply because you're not hitting the direct target of the question. So what they want you to be doing is using something that is a lot more comparative. So for every paragraph, I want you to be picking a point from source A and a point from source B. So the way that you should be approaching this question is read through both sources, check whether you're looking for similarities or differences, check specifically what those similarities and differences should be about. So for example, it might say differences about the 2 trains that the writers are travelling on. You don't then talk about differences in the sources as a whole, you only talk about those differences that are related to the specific topic that it asks you to be focusing on. And I would recommend doing 2 to 3 paragraphs, with each paragraph following the structure of point, evidence from source A, evidence from source B, and then an explanation of why that difference arises. Can you elaborate on the difference or the similarity? Can you discuss it in a bit more detail? So for example, if we go back to this idea of trains, it might be that in the first text, the train was travelling very quickly. In the second text, the train was travelling very slowly. And you quite literally say difference in speed, taking a bit from source A, taking a bit from source B, and then why is that the case? Look at the text as a whole. Maybe that first train was a bullet train in Japan and that second train was some sort of country train through the Welsh countryside. I don't know, this is the most irrelevant example ever, but do you see how to structure your paragraphs? It's as simple as that. And the reason why it is as simple as that is because hitting top band is not about really deep analysis. It's about focused analysis, clear analysis. They just want you to pick the points and pick where in the sources that difference or similarity comes from. You don't need to be putting on this persona of, incredible analysis. It's not like the question 2 in English Language Paper 1 where you really need deep language analysis. In this question, it is pretty surface level. Yes, if you can consider any points that might be going ever so slightly deeper, but you shouldn't be inferring, you should basically be looking at what is in the text and going, okay, this is the similarity, this is the difference, this is how I'm going to explain it, and this is how I'm going to move on to the next question. Now, question 3 is going to ask you to focus on a specific source and a specific section of that source. Once again, if you think that you might accidentally go over or you might look at different parts of the text, draw a massive box around the section of the text that you need to be looking at and only look inside that box. That's going to keep you focused and make sure you're not making any good points, but that aren't going to get you any marks if they're outside that particular section. And you're going to be looking at language analysis. So question 3 of English Language Paper 2 is basically the same as question 2 of English Language Paper 1. It is language techniques. It is thinking about what rhetorical devices that the writer has been using, why the writer has decided to use them, and this makes the petasel structure a really good one for you to use in your paragraph. So what the structure is P, point, make your point, what has the writer used language to show, or what is the purpose of that language, and then you're going to take your evidence, you're going to take your quotation from within the lines, and then you're going to think about what's the technique that is being used, can you explain the technique, then you're going to analyse it. So why has the writer chosen to use this? What effect does it bring to the text as a whole? So you're not just thinking, okay, it's a metaphor, why has the writer used a metaphor in this particular section? You're also just thinking about what is the impact of that metaphor on the way in which you interpret the text as a whole. How does it influence the takeaway message for you as the reader reading that text? And you need to remember that you are the reader. You are the reason that all of these language techniques are being used. So what do you actually feel when you read them? What impression does it make on you? That is the sort of analysis that you really want to be thinking of. Then you're going to link back to the question. So this is just making sure that you are staying focused on writing. And because often in the question, it'll say something like, how does a writer use language to describe whatever? In this link, you're going back and you're saying, okay, so the language device of whatever it was described to do whatever the particular situation was, and just elaborating on that as to how, why, reiterating the effect. And then, if you can, zoom in. So let's say you were looking at a metaphor, but you could zoom in on a specific word choice, a specific adjective, a specific noun that has been used within that metaphor, and just spend a couple of sentences zooming in, analysing that very specific feature, because doing this is picking up those additional points that will allow you to go from the second to top band to the top band, because what being in the top band requires from you is the ability to go deeper, to analyse individual components of the wider text. And by sort of finding a way to zoom in into every single one of your points, you're really going to be showing the examiner that you know how to do that. And once again, with this, you should be aiming for 2 or 3 pretty detailed paragraphs following that structure that we have just discussed. And then you're going to be on question 4. Now, a lot of people do not like question 4. I did not particularly enjoy question 4, but it's all about comparing the perspectives of the 2 different sources. So this question is always going to ask you to compare the way that the writers convey their different feelings and perspectives about whatever situation that those 2 sources are referencing. And then underneath it'll give you some prompts, and it'll say pretty much every single time the exact thing of, in your answer you could compare their different feelings and perspectives, compare the methods that the writers use to convey their different feelings and perspectives, and support your response with references to both texts. Now it says in your answer you could, it should say in your answer you must, because those are the 3 points that need to be covered if you want to be getting top marks. Each one of them is a separate assessment objective. If you only hit 2, you can never hit top band marks, because you need to be covering all 3 of these areas. Now what that means is you don't want to be focusing too much on one of the sources versus the other. No, this is a comparison. So for every point you make, you should be referencing both of the sources. You also need to make sure that you're looking for language devices, you're looking for structural devices. You're not only looking for example, similar language devices that are used to convey different things, or the same thing conveyed using different language devices. You're also looking for different things that are conveyed differently, which I know sounds very, very weird, because is that a comparison? But it is. Because the fundamental premise of this question is it wants you to really understand what is the point of those 2 sources. And then once you've grasped what the point of the 2 sources are, any time that you're referencing the 2 of them in conjunction, that is you making a comparison. Now, a lot of students really struggle to structure their response to question 4. So this is the paragraph structure that I use, and I would generally do 2 to 3 really quite detailed paragraphs. And the structure is called Peter Peter. It doesn't exactly follow that acronym, but I think Peter Peter is easier to remember. So it starts with your point. Okay, what is the point of difference or the point of similarity that you are going to be discussing? Now, yes, trying to come up with those points can be really quite difficult, but it's about thinking, okay, does one of the sources have a positive view of the topic, whereas the other has a negative view of the topic? That is the most fundamental thing that you can think of straight away. And as you're looking through and finding evidence of that, then you'll be able to find subsequent things. So for example, if we go back to this train example, then, I don't know, one of the writers might have been talking about how pleasant the interior of the train is. One of them might be talking about how they really dislike the interior of the train, and that is another point of comparison that you can be making. Alternatively, they might have both liked it, whatever it is. So you're going to take that, that's your point, and then you're going to find evidence from source A to back up that point, or to back up source A's part of that point. You're going to take that evidence, you're going to look at what the technique is, then you're going to talk about the effect of that particular use of structure, that particular use of language, that particular rhetorical device. And then you're going to think about your relation now to source B. So you've taken your evidence, you've explained the technique, you've explained the effect for source A, you're going to relate it to source B. So this is not taking your evidence for source B yet. This is saying, is source A similar or is source A different to source B, and why? Crucially, in making this link between the two, can you make a contextual link as well? So if their perceptions are different, say why their perceptions are different as well, because a lot of students will lose marks because they only talk about the differences in the technique, the differences in the language, the differences in the structure, but they don't think about why that difference actually occurs given the context of the two different sources. So if you can come up with something to explain that, you might not be able to do this for every point that you make, but if you can do this for the majority of points, then you're going to be able to clock up those marks as well, showing the examiner that you're a lot more confident. And then you're going to be going on and kind of reiterating your point for source B. You don't necessarily have to do this. You can move straight on to finding evidence from source B, talking about the technique in that evidence, and then explaining the effect of that particular language or structural device. And then at the end of all of the paragraphs, make sure you are relating back directly to the question, directly to the specific focus of comparing the writer's feelings and perspectives. What is that specific area that you should be comparing on? Just link back to it at the end of the paragraph, reiterating your point to show the examiner that you are staying very focused, not going off track. And that also is a bit of a help for yourself to make sure that you don't start waffling about something that you aren't going to get credited for. And then that is one paragraph. You might want to split it into two paragraphs if you like to have source A in the first paragraph, source B in the second paragraph, but it makes 1 point paragraph, as it were, and you're going to repeat that once or twice more. And then we are on to the next section. This is question 5, and this is the writing. Now, in English Language Paper 1, this is creative writing. In English Language Paper 2, this is non-fictional writing. Now, it's actually a little bit more restrictive in this paper because you're going to be explicitly asked to write in a certain style. And that could be article, letter, speech, essay, or leaflet. And you're not going to know until you sit in the exam. That can be quite nerve-wracking, but there are different ways of structuring each of those different things that you can remember really quite easily and replicate in the exam. No matter what style it is, you're going to need persuasive techniques, and the acronym that's going to help you remember that is DAFOREST. That is direct address, so that is saying you need to care about this topic, you need to pick up your recycling, whatever it's going to be about. Then A, there's anecdotes, so thinking about bringing in personal stories. When, I was 12, I joined a litter picking group in my community, whatever it is, sticking on this environmental theme, I guess. Then F, facts. It's make them up. Like the purpose is this does not have to be correct. Say whatever you like. Make it moderately believable. Don't make up something that is ridiculous that the examiner's going to go, they put no thought into this, but you don't have to be fully correct. And then O is opinion, but give these as facts. Don't say I think, I believe. You could use I believe, but don't use I think. Use things more like the current method is failing. The system is whatever. That is an opinion, but you're expressing it as a fact. That is more persuasive. That is a better rhetorical device. And then you could also have rhetorical questions. So, would you drop your litter in the street? You're just having an empty question without an answer, but it's a very powerful device. Emotive language, the amount of litter that is being dropped is a catastrophe, it is an environmental disaster, using things that are slightly more heartfelt that get the reader, really sort of passionate about whatever you're writing about. Statistics, again, make them up, make them slightly believable, but make them up. And triples can also be a good thing. So that's where you have 3 consecutive adjectives. Now, in terms of structuring, no matter what the actual thing is that you need to be writing, you need an immensely powerful introduction and an equally powerful conclusion. Your body should be very well thought through, and this should be where you're putting things in, like statistics, like your facts, like coming up with some really interesting points. I would generally do 2 to 3 paragraphs, each focusing on one point, developing it and explaining it. And instead of, you can still use your Peeled sort of structure for paragraphs, and that still works very well. But the way that it is, you would have a point, and then instead of evidence being a language device or a structural technique, you'd have a fact, you'd have some statistics, and then your explanation would be explaining why those statistics are important, why they are relevant, why this issue is something that people should care about. And then you're obviously linking back and thinking more broadly. So you're going to do that 2 or 3 times in your body, but your introduction and your conclusion, that is what the majority of your marks are going to be based off. Every time in the examiner's report, it goes on and on about how they weight the introduction and the conclusion more than they do the middle. So spend time making sure they are powerful, they are emotive, they use a lot of persuasive devices. If you've got something that's like a leaflet or an article, you want a header, you want something at the top of your page that is making it formatted in the way that a leaflet or an article would be formatted. Don't spend time drawing pictures, you don't need to. But you can, if you wish, leave a box that would be where a picture would go and draw a little stick man in it or something. But obviously it's not an art exam, so you're not actually going to get any marks, but it would sort of develop the marks that you are getting for it being written in the form that it is requesting you. Good luck for English Language Paper 2 exam. I hope everything goes well. And if you have any specific questions, particularly about the ways of formatting, the different styles for question 5, then do let me know in the comments and I'll do my best to respond.